44-year-old Raymond Chandler just lost his job as an accountant due to his heavy drinking. The future looked bleak. The year, 1932. There is nothing like losing your money in order to see who your friends are, he would say. Needless to say, none of his friends remained, but what he did have was a plan. Welcome to House of Words, a podcast about writers, dedication, and hard-boiled detectives. I'm your host, Jason Moore Harden, inviting you to join us as we explore the origins of the writing life of Raymond Chandler and his debut novel, The Big Sleep. The silver lining of being fired from a career spanning almost 13 years was that the experience was harsh enough to jolt Raymond Chandler out of his self-destructive path. Jobless, he retreated to Seattle, where he managed to kick the booze. After 2 months there, however, he received word that his ex-lover, the love of his life, Sissy Pascal, had fallen ill with pneumonia again. Now, his instinct told him to go be with her and do all he could for her. Thus, he returned to L.A. He didn't own much of anything. He did nonetheless have enough money to support himself and Sissy for the immediate future. With no family who could offer lifelines in times of disaster, he had always been very conscious of how little stood between himself and Skid Row, particularly if he were to start drinking again. So he remained sober. Furthermore, there wasn't a single person in the city whom he could count on to bail him out or even offer a room in which to stay. Similarly, Sissy had no money. Plus, she'd successfully insulted most of her friends who might have previously lent a hand. All they had was one another against the world. So they devised a plan to get away from the high cost of central Los Angeles to the cheaper rental apartments in Santa Monica. At the same time, Raymond was busy discovering how to make money from writing fiction. They survived totally on the money he'd saved up. Though he'd written poetry in the past, it was a daring decision to decide that he would enter a branch of writing completely foreign to him. Fiction. What kind of fiction, he wondered. Driving up and down the Pacific coast, he began to pick up pulp magazines. Now, seeing as they were cheap enough to throw away once he was done with them, and since women's magazines didn't appeal, it was a fair deal. What he discovered was forceful and honest writing that captivated him. He came to the realization that writing pulp fiction could be a good way to learn how to write while simultaneously getting paid a nominal sum. However, he decided to approach his new endeavor more methodically than he'd approached his earlier poetry writings. He was business-minded enough and patient enough this time around to understand that he first needed to learn the mechanics of fiction in order to sell whatever talent he had. So, just as he'd done to become an accountant, he enrolled in a local evening course and bought a few books on the subject. Soon enough, he noticed that fiction was far more demanding than he'd expected. "I could hardly get his hat off," Chandler would say of one of his early exercises. He figured that it would be 2 to 3 years before he could get a character out of a room convincingly, and even longer before he could control a scene involving more than 2 characters. Writing was, nonetheless, a form of discipline that an alcoholic on the dry could lean on to keep himself occupied. On the other hand, there was the necessity to bring in some money as well. Well, gradually, he grew more fascinated by the mechanics. He even experimented with the physical process of typing. He began using narrow yellow pieces of paper which he would feed into his typewriter with the long edge horizontal. Each sheet was about the size of a small paperback book laid on its side, which allowed him room to write only 12 to 15 lines. It was a trick, he discovered, which forced him to put a bit of magic onto each small sheet, be it an image, description, or a wisecrack. It kept the writing fast and tight, and also helped him to avoid revising and editing. Instead, he would rewrite the whole page if he deemed it less than optimal. Another method he used to sharpen his skills was trying to rewrite a story he liked. After completing his version, he'd reread the original story and try to catch the weaknesses in his own writing. By doing this, he was also learning that intricate and impossible to explain flow of a well-written story. Since the 1920s, American fiction had veered towards tough, hard-boiled detective stories. As a result, pulp magazines began to appear, one of these being Black Mask. And by 1933, Black Mask was exclusively publishing crime stories and had a well-respected circulation of more than 100,000 issues a month. Now, Chandler's first submission, which was accepted by Black Mask, Blackmailers Don't Shoot, took 5 months to write. During this time, he rewrote the story 5 times, a dedication that revealed just how serious he was about becoming a real writer and not merely making a quick buck. The story, however, was and is almost completely indecipherable. Even after repeated readings, it proves near impossible to understand what is taking place in the story. Now, this is partly a consequence of his refusal to map out plots. He considered them superfluous to the new realistic spirit of detective fiction. He felt that the English-style twist-in-the-tail mystery stories went heads up against the realism of detective fiction, saying, "To get the surprise murderer, you fake character. If people want to play that game, it's all right by me. But for Christ's sake, let's not talk about honest mysteries. They don't exist." Now, it is quite possible that the story would have been less confusing if the detective of the story were the narrator, but Blackmailers Don't Shoot is written in the third person, making the story even more difficult to comprehend. Well, he continued to experiment with different types of narratives in his Black Mask stories, before he finally settled for the first-person narrative that would become his trademark. Now, while he started work on his second Black Mask story in 1933, he and Sissy continued to exhaust his savings. The $180 he received for Blackmailers was a nominal amount for 5 months' work, even during the Depression. Now, after earning almost $3,000 a month as an accountant, he despised having no money and felt no sense of dignified poverty about his situation. He disagreed entirely with the idea that struggling writers were more creative the closer they were to the breadline. Well, he and Sissy were on the edge of joining that line. "I never slept in the park, but I came damn close to it. It didn't kill me, but neither did it increase my love of humanity." Now, Sissy's patience with and continued love for Chandler over this time won his eternal respect. Living as reclusively as they did in their Santa Monica apartment, the two of them became inseparable and fell back in love again. Now, jumping to October 1934, when his third story was published, Finger Man, written in the first person, this story revealed that he was finding his footing. Now, despite being hard to decipher, he held his own in the 2 earlier stories, but now he was starting to do something profoundly different and doing it with confidence. While achieving growing recognition and earning larger fees, though still never more than $350 for his Black Mask stories, he and Sissy continued to live in low-rent Santa Monica. Even writing 5 stories a year, as he did in 1936, only earned him $1,500. He was still not producing stories quickly enough to reach the 1,000,000 words a year that a pulp writer needed to turn out in order to get a decent income. Though things were dire, a break came in 1938 when Sidney Sanders, a New York literary agent, showed some of Chandler's pulp stories to publisher Alfred Knopf. Now, Knopf was impressed, so Knopf reached out to him with the news that he'd be interested in reading a full novel from him. Chandler was 50 years old, but he was far from being done. Quote, "If my books had been any worse, I should not have been invited to Hollywood. And if they had been any better, I should not have come." End quote. Raymond Chandler had become one of the best pulp writers in America, doing so impressively quick. However, this rise came at a cost. It took 5 years of nearly complete reclusiveness. His complexion had paled, and he suffered from rheumatism in his right arm. Of this sacrifice, he would later say, "Most writers sacrifice too much humanity for too little art." He was on the edge of what he'd hoped for, so it was time to get on with the writing and see whether his own sacrifice had been worthwhile. The title, The Big Sleep, derived from the ending of the novel where Detective Marlowe is standing at the same old oil field as at the beginning, narrating, "Oil and water were the same as wind and air to you. You just slept the big sleep, not caring about the nastiness of how you died or where you fell. Me, I was a part of the nastiness now." The story was written in their Santa Monica apartment over the summer of 1938, and the setting was again Los Angeles. The framework and structure of the story was basically a collage of his best Black Mask plots and didn't stand out in any great way. Rather, it was the book's hero, Detective Philip Marlowe, which set the story apart from anything Chandler had previously written. Named after Marlowe House at Dulwich College, the novel's narrator and hero was a 30-year-old single man. "I'm unmarried because I don't like policemen's wives," he would say. Now, very soon into the novel, it becomes obvious that Marlowe was different from the fictional pup detectives that had come before him. He played chess by himself. He often felt paranoid. He had an inner world that made him vulnerable and interesting. Quite simply put, Philip Marlowe felt real. As real as a Pulp Fiction detective ever could, that is. Now, he found a pleasant surprise in writing novel-length fiction. It gave him more freedom to experiment in ways that short pulp stories hadn't allowed. While the violence and the stock characters were still there, he was able to diminish the focus on the mystery element of his story and focus more on atmosphere and character, both elements he was more interested in. Now, writing the novel also gave him day-to-day structure, which was important. You see, although he'd been sober for quite a while by this time, routine was vital for an alcoholic such as himself. So with this in mind, he would wake up early and get to work. He'd type away until lunch, at which time he would call it a day. He felt that every writer should find a window of at least 4 hours a day to dedicate solely to writing and nothing else. One doesn't have to write. However, one isn't allowed to do anything else productive or positive during those hours. The rest of the afternoon would be spent relaxing, reading magazines, and driving Sissy to stores. A typical day's wind-up for the couple was listening to evening classical music on the radio and drinking English tea together. Regarding content, he took certain liberties when writing the book, one of which was borrowing or adapting material from his old pulp stories and incorporating them into The Big Sleep. He considered the book to be enough of a departure from his short story work to allow for this freedom. It would therefore not be surprising to anyone who had read his story, The Curtain, in the 1936 issue of Black Mask magazine to find a familiar, if not identical, plot. Now, the subplot of the novel was similarly taken from his story, Killer in the Rain, published in Black Mask in 1935. Many of the fight scenes were also borrowed from other short stories, often near verbatim. Well, the novel was complete and in the hands of Alfred Knopf by autumn of 1938, and everyone seemed more than satisfied. Knopf was so delighted that he bought the entire front cover of Publishers Weekly in order to advertise his newest author, believing that he had found the next hard-boiled writing talent. That was not a sentiment shared by critics, however, who found the novel to be too crude. In particular, some of the more realistic elements, like the numerous alcoholic characters, a drug-taking psychotic nymphomaniac, a pornography racket, adulterers, explicitly described corpses, and a homosexual assassin. Although Chandler insisted that these characters were meant to add realism to the story, the fact that no crime writer of the time had gone to such length made it a difficult point for many to swallow, regardless of how close to the reality of 1930s Los Angeles life it was. Now, despite the critics, the book sold well. 18,000 copies, which includes British sales. He only made $2,000 from these sales. Not that $2,000 was anything to frown at, being equivalent to roughly $45,000 today. It did allow him to lower his shoulders somewhat. On the other hand, it wasn't the big break he was hoping for either. The material was too explicit for Hollywood, who showed no interest in buying the film rights. Thus, Chandler had to continue writing pulp stories to make ends meet. At the very least, he and Sissy were able to move out of their cramped Santa Monica apartment that had been their home for the last 5 years. Good times and bad lay ahead, and thus the sun would shine on Raymond Chandler yet again. A story we might continue to explore in a future episode. Until then, let me leave you with a quote from the boundary-pushing no-ear writer himself. If you're not tough, it's hard to survive in this world, and if you're not kind, then you don't deserve to survive. End quote. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and will spread the word about the podcast. Once again, I have been your host, Jason Nemore Harden. We here at House of Words ask that you please consider helping to make this show easier to produce and more frequent by contributing on our Patreon page at patreon.com/House of Words or paypal.me/House of Words Podcast. Alternatively, you can like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube page and encourage others who may find what we offer interesting to do the same at House of Words Podcast. Every little bit helps, more than you might think. Until next time, keep turning those pages. House of Words is written and produced by Cristo M. Sanchez. Narrated and written by me, Jason Nemore Harden. And music by Creature 9 and Wood. All rights and ownership belong to Cristo M. Sanchez and Jason Nemore Harden.